The night everything breaks open. Connor is 16, there's a broken curfew, and Grant is sitting at the kitchen table waiting. Not furious, not pacing, just waiting. The way a parent waits, when they've already decided that calm is the only language worth speaking anymore. Connor walks in 47 minutes late. No text, no call. Grant asks one question: where were you? Connor gives him the look, the one teenagers have perfected across generations, the one that means you don't have the right to ask me that. Grant gives him 2 weeks without the car. Reasonable, proportionate. The exact same consequence his daughter Lily received 3 months earlier when she missed curfew by an hour. By morning, the consequence is gone, not because Grant took it back, because Serena did. That's where this story actually starts. Not with the accusation, not with the word abuse being said out loud in the therapist's office 2 years later. It starts in the small reversals, the ones that happen quietly, behind closed doors, while the house is still pretending everything is fine. But we'll get there, because right now I want to go back further, back to the beginning, when Grant was still someone Serena described as exactly what Connor needs. Grant met Serena when Connor was 4 years old. She was 31, recently divorced, working 2 jobs and raising a little boy who, by her own description, had no consistent male presence and was starting to show it. She wasn't looking for a boyfriend. She was looking for stability. She said that on their 3rd date. Grant respected her for it. They took it slow. 18 months before he met Connor. Another year before he moved in. Grant didn't rush it. He'd watched too many people rush it. He also had Lily, his daughter from a previous relationship, 8 at the time, who split weeks between her mom's house and Grant's. When Grant moved in with Serena, Lily started spending her weeks there too. 2 kids under one roof, different histories, same household. Grant made one decision early and stuck to it. Same rules, same expectations, same consequences. Not because he was rigid, because he'd seen what happened to kids who grew up knowing that the adults around them operated on separate systems, that love in one corner of a house looked completely different from love in another corner. He'd grown up in a house like that. He wasn't building another one. Connor did his homework before screens. So did Lily. Connor kept his room to a livable standard. So did Lily. Connor spoke to adults with basic respect, returned texts when he said he would, showed up when he committed to something. Lily did the same. And for a while, a solid, deceptively smooth while, Serena called this exactly what she'd hoped for. She told her friends Grant was the most consistent man she'd ever been with. She told her mother he was finally someone who took the parenting seriously. She told Grant himself on a Tuesday evening, when Connor had cleaned up after dinner without being asked, that she didn't know how she'd done any of this without him. That was 7 years ago. The accusation came on a Thursday. Here's what I want you to hold on to right now. Not the accusation, not what Serena said in that office, not the words she chose. I want you to hold on to the gap. The 7 years between "this is exactly what Connor needs" and "what you've been doing to my son is not okay." Because something happened in that gap, and it wasn't Grant. What happened was quieter than that, more patient. The kind of thing you can only see if you watch the whole sequence. Not the moments Grant set a boundary, but the moments immediately after. Who walked into Connor's room when the door was closed? What was said? What was walked back? What Connor was told, privately, about why the rules didn't have to apply the same way they applied to Lily. Grant didn't know the content of those conversations for a long time. He just noticed that Connor's behavior reset every few weeks, that consequences dissolved, that the ground he thought they'd covered together, he and Connor, slowly, with real friction and real repair, kept going soft. He told himself it was adolescence, that this was just how it went with stepkids, that patience was the job. He wasn't wrong about patience being the job. He was wrong about why he needed it. The first time Grant noticed something was off, he dismissed it. Connor was 11. Grant had told him no screens until the weekend reading was done, A rule that had been in place for months. One Connor had stopped fighting because it was consistent and he knew it. That Thursday evening, Grant walked past Connor's room and heard the unmistakable sound of a game running. He knocked, opened the door. Connor looked up without flinching. Mom said it was fine. Grant didn't raise his voice. He walked back downstairs and asked Serena, quietly, why Connor was on his console. She was distracted, half watching something, and she said she hadn't realized, that she'd just told him to relax for a bit, that she hadn't been thinking. Grant let it go. He shouldn't have. Not because it was catastrophic, it wasn't, but because a child who is 11 is already doing math. And Connor had just learned something Grant didn't know he'd been taught. The rule has 2 enforcement points, and one of them moves. Here's what made it hard to see clearly. Serena was not a bad mother. That matters. She was present, attentive, genuinely devoted to Connor in the way that some parents are devoted, almost anxiously so, as if the love is too big to contain in ordinary moments and needs somewhere dramatic to go. She had carried a lot of guilt from the divorce. Not about the decision. She'd made the right call leaving Connor's father, a man named Paul who was present in paperwork only. But about the disruption. About what Connor had lost before he was old enough to name it. She had spent years trying to be enough for him, both parents in one. And then Grant came in. And Grant had the audacity to be consistent. You'd think that would be welcome. She'd said it was welcome. She'd built a whole picture in her head of what it would mean for Connor to have someone steady, someone who held the line, someone who didn't fold every time Connor's expression went dark. The problem was that holding the line felt different from the inside than it sounded in theory. When Grant told Connor no, and Connor came to Serena with those eyes, the ones that had been working on her since he was 3, the ones she had never once successfully resisted, she didn't experience herself as undermining a parenting decision. She experienced herself as protecting her son from unnecessary hardship. That's the word she would have used in those early years, unnecessary. Which means she had her own framework running, her own internal rubric for which of Grant's calls were legitimate and which crossed a line she had not yet articulated but could always feel. Grant didn't know the rubric existed. He thought they were on the same team. He thought when she praised his consistency, she meant she was going to back it up. If you've ever parented alongside someone who says yes to everything your no was supposed to hold, subscribe. You already know where this goes, and I need you here for it. Between Connor's 11th birthday and his 14th, Grant can identify, looking back with the clarity that only distance gives you, at least 9 separate instances where a consequence he set was reversed without a conversation, not overruled after a discussion, reversed quietly, privately, in the space between Grant leaving a room and Connor learning that space existed. 9 he can identify. That's the number he's certain about. He believes the real number is higher. What was Connor learning? Nothing sinister, not yet. He was learning the architecture of his own house. He was learning which parent was the ceiling and which was the floor. He was learning, the way all children learn without being taught, that the gap between 2 adults who aren't communicating is a livable space. He moved in. And Serena, this is the part I need you to sit with. Serena watched it happen and felt something that she would later, under pressure, describe as protectiveness, but which looked, from the outside, like relief. Because every time she walked back one of Grant's calls, Connor was grateful in the specific way that fills a hole in you. The way children are grateful when they believe you have chosen them over something. She liked being the one he came to. She liked being the softer landing. She just didn't want to say that out loud, not even to herself. And Grant kept showing up. Kept setting the expectations, kept being the person who said the hard thing. He thought he was building something with Connor. He was. He just didn't realize Serena was quietly taking it apart on the other side. Not out of malice, never out of malice, but out of a need she hadn't examined yet. The thing about an unexamined need is it doesn't stay small. It grows into the shape of whatever story it needs to survive. Serena's story, the one she was already writing without knowing it, needed a villain, and Grant was the only one holding anything firm enough to fill the role. Connor is 13 the first time he uses it deliberately. Not the gap between his parents. That's been available for 2 years by now, and he's been using it the way all kids use available space, instinctively, without strategy. But 13 is different. 13 is the age when a child stops stumbling into advantage and starts reaching for it. Grant asks him to redo a piece of schoolwork, not harshly, not with punishment attached. The assignment was careless. Connor is capable of significantly better, and they both know it. Grant sits down with him, shows him where the thinking broke down, asks him to take another pass. Connor looks at him and says, "My mom already said it was fine." She hadn't seen it. Grant knew she hadn't seen it because he'd been the one to go through the school bag that evening. But the sentence wasn't about the assignment. The sentence was a test. Connor was checking whether the name alone was enough to close the conversation. Grant didn't fold. He said, calmly, that he and his mom could talk about it, but the work still needed another pass. Connor did it, slammed his door on the way back to his room, but he did it. That night, after Connor was in bed, Grant told Serena what had happened. Not as an accusation, as a check-in. Did she want to present a united front on this? Because Connor was starting to triangulate, and it was going to get harder if they let it develop. Serena listened, said she understood, said, of course, they were a team. 2 days later, she told Connor that Grant sometimes had unrealistic expectations, and that he should come to her if something felt unfair. Grant didn't find that out for months. Here's what I want to ask you, and I want you to actually think about it before the answer comes easy. If you watched someone you loved get slowly positioned as the problem, and the positioning was always done warmly, always done out of something that looked like protection, always done without a single moment that was clean enough to confront, when would you have said something? Drop that in the comments. Because I think about Grant's timeline, and I don't have a clean answer. And I've been sitting with this story for a while. The language shifted around Connor's 14th birthday. Before that, Serena's complaints about Grant's parenting were specific. He was too rigid about screen time. He didn't allow enough flexibility on weekends. His consequences lasted too long for the infraction. These were disagreements Grant could engage with. He didn't always agree, but they were the normal friction of two adults with different instincts trying to raise kids in the same house. After 14, the language went abstract. Grant was too hard on Connor. Grant didn't understand Connor the way she did. Grant held Connor to a standard that wasn't fair. And when Grant asked what standard she meant, and pointed out that Lily had the same expectations, Serena said that was exactly the problem. That Connor wasn't Lily. That Connor had a different history and a different nervous system, and that what Grant called consistency, Connor experienced as pressure. Grant asked if Connor had said that. Serena said she knew her son. He asked if they could talk to a family therapist. Not because anything was broken yet, but because he could feel the foundation moving, and he wanted someone neutral in the room before it became a crisis. Serena said she'd think about it. She didn't think about it. Or she did, and the answer was no. Because suggesting therapy meant creating a space where Grant could say things she wasn't ready to hear on the record. Lily noticed before Grant did. She was 16 by then, sharp in the way that girls who have watched adults closely since they were small tend to be sharp. She came to Grant on a Sunday morning while Serena and Connor were out, and she said, carefully, that she wanted to tell him something, and she needed him not to make it a big thing. She said that Connor talked differently about him when Serena was around, that Connor would say things to his friends on the phone, things Lily overheard through the wall, not deliberately, just the way you hear things in a shared house, Things about Grant that didn't match anything Lily recognized. That Grant was controlling. That Grant had always had it out for him. That Grant treated Lily better because she was his real kid. Grant sat with that for a long time. He wasn't shocked, which was its own kind of information. The part of him that had been watching the ground go soft for 3 years wasn't shocked at all. He asked Lily one question. "Does your mom know what Connor says?" Lily looked at him with the particular expression of a teenager who has already done the math and is watching you catch up. She said, "I think she knows." And that was the moment Grant understood that this wasn't a miscommunication. This was a version of him that had been built, carefully, consistently, over years, in a room he was never invited into. And the person it was built for was standing on the other side of a door that was about to open. He just didn't know yet what he would find when it did. Grant did something that week that he hadn't done in 11 years of parenting. He started writing things down. Not dramatically, not with the intention of using it for anything. He bought a plain notebook, the kind with no significance, the kind you'd pick up without thinking, and he started recording dates and incidents. Not his feelings about them, just what happened, what he said, what was said back, and what changed afterward without explanation. He filled 14 pages in 3 months. He didn't show it to anyone. He wasn't even sure why he was doing it. He told himself it was for clarity, that he was someone who processed by writing things down, and that the notebook was just an extension of that. But the truth, the one he wasn't quite ready to say out loud yet, was that he was starting to feel like a man who might one day need to prove that his version of events existed. That's a particular kind of lonely. To live in a house with people you love and to begin quietly documenting your own presence in it. The accusation didn't come from nowhere. That's what I need you to understand before we get there. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a single bad night that pushed Serena past a line she'd been holding. It was the conclusion of a story she had been writing for a long time. And the moment she said it out loud, in that therapist's office, it had the shape of something she'd believed for years. She wasn't lying. That's the complicated part. She genuinely believed it. Because the version of Grant that existed in the story she and Connor had been building together in private was real to her. It had texture and history and specific examples that, taken without context, without the 14 pages in the notebook, without Lily's testimony or the pattern of reversals or the 9 consequences that dissolved in the dark, taken alone, each one sounded like something. A man who expected too much. A man who couldn't distinguish discipline from control. A man who, perhaps unconsciously, held his stepson to a higher standard than his biological daughter. That last one. That's the one that would follow Grant out of that office and into every room he walked into for the next year. Because it was the precise inversion of the truth. And inversions are the hardest thing to fight. You can dispute a lie. You can produce evidence against a fabrication. But when someone takes the exact shape of what you actually did and flips it, when the consistency becomes the evidence of the harm, you don't have a fact problem. You have a reality problem. And reality problems don't resolve in a single conversation. Tell me, and I genuinely want to know, have you ever had your most careful behavior turned into the proof of something you didn't do? Because the comments on this kind of story are always the most honest place on the internet. I'll be reading. The therapist was Serena's choice. That matters, though Grant didn't clock it at the time. He was relieved they were finally in a room with a third party. He'd been asking for this for months. He walked in prepared to talk about co-parenting alignment and the triangulation pattern and the ways Connor had learned to use the gap between them. He walked into an ambush. Not a coordinated one, not in the way that implies strategy. More like the natural consequence of 2 people who had been preparing for very different conversations arriving in the same room at the same time. Serena had things written down, too. Not in a notebook, in her head. In the precise, practiced way you hold something when you've been turning it over for a long time and have finally decided to say it. She said Grant had been too hard on Connor since the beginning. She said the consistency he was so proud of was experienced by Connor as targeting. She said Connor had told her things, specific things, things she wouldn't share in front of Grant because Connor had a right to his privacy. That concerned her about the environment he was growing up in. She used the word environment 3 times. She did not use the word abuse in that first session. That came later. But the architecture was there, the framing was there, and the therapist, who had heard Serena's version in a preliminary call that Grant didn't know had happened, was already oriented. Grant asked if he could share some things from his perspective. The therapist said, "Of course." Grant started talking. He talked about the reversals, the 9 consequences he could document, Lily's account of what Connor said on the phone, the 2 years of asking for exactly this conversation and being told she'd think about it. He watched Serena's expression as he spoke. She wasn't surprised by anything he said. She was waiting. The way you wait when you already know the shape of the argument because you have spent a long time building the counter to it. When he finished, she looked at the therapist and said, "This is exactly what I mean. He keeps documentation on his stepson. He has a running record. What kind of parent does that?" Grant felt the room tilt. He'd brought the evidence, and she'd made the evidence the crime. Lily was right. This had been going on for a long time, and it wasn't close to over. Grant drove home from that session in silence. Not the silence of someone who has nothing to say, the silence of someone who has too much, who is holding so many things at once that speaking would require choosing one, and he couldn't choose one yet because they were all pressing against each other with equal weight. He was angry. He was gutted. He was, underneath both of those, something he hadn't expected to feel in a therapist's office at 44 years old. He was embarrassed. Not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he had walked into that room trusting the process, and the process had been arranged before he arrived. And the part of him that believed in good faith, that had always believed, a little too firmly, that if you just show up and tell the truth will land. That part felt foolish in a way that stung past the anger. He thought about the notebook in his car, the 14 pages, the careful, undramatic record of what had actually happened in his house for the past 3 years. He thought about how Serena had turned it into a weapon in under 60 seconds. The following weeks moved the way things move when a structure is failing, faster than feels possible, and with a kind of terrible momentum. Serena told her sister. Her sister told her mother. Connor, who had been present for none of the therapy session, but had clearly been briefed on some version of it, started treating Grant with a new quality of distance. Not the sullen, transactional distance of a teenager who is annoyed. Something more deliberate, more like a decision. Grant kept showing up. This is the part I need you to understand, because it's the part that gets erased in the version of this story that Serena was telling. Grant kept coming to dinner, kept driving Connor to his Saturday training sessions because Connor still hadn't said he didn't want him to. Kept asking how school was going, kept checking in on the things Connor had mentioned in passing. A test he was nervous about, a disagreement with a teammate. The ordinary maintenance of caring about someone's life. Connor answered in the minimum viable way, but he answered. And in those small, obligatory exchanges, Grant was watching something he hadn't been able to see clearly before. The specific texture of Connor's discomfort. Because it wasn't the discomfort of a kid who resents the person driving him. It was the discomfort of a kid who has been told to feel one thing and keeps feeling another. Connor was 16. He wasn't a child anymore. He had been living in the gap between 2 versions of the same man for years. The one his mother described in private, and the one who showed up on Saturday mornings with coffee and said nothing about the distance and just drove him where he needed to go. At some point, those 2 versions have to reconcile. Serena hadn't accounted for that. The second therapy session was worse than the first, and then there wasn't a third. Grant went in with the notebook. Not to brandish it, he'd learned that lesson, but because he wanted the record present in case specific incidents were raised. He wanted to be able to respond to specific things with specific facts rather than general disagreement. Serena arrived with a printed document, 4 pages. A timeline she had constructed of what she called a pattern of disproportionate discipline, going back 7 years. Grant looked at the dates on her document and then looked at his notebook and understood something that settled over him like cold water. The incidents she had listed? He had documentation for almost all of them. Context, follow-up, outcome. Including 4 instances where she had reversed the consequence he'd set. Consequences that were listed in her document as evidence of his harshness, but which, in her version, simply ended, as if they dissolved on their own, as if time had softened them. She had built a case, a real, structured, detailed case, and she had removed herself from it entirely. In her document, Serena did not appear. There was no mention of the reversals, no mention of what she had told Connor in private. No mention of the conversation where she'd said Grant had unrealistic expectations and Connor should come to her if something felt unfair. She was not a character in her own account. She was simply the mother documenting what she had witnessed. Grant put the notebook on the table. The therapist looked at it. He said, "I'd like to go through this together, date by date, because I think there's a version of events in that document that's missing some material information, and I'd like the chance to provide it." Serena said she didn't feel comfortable with that approach. The therapist looked between them, and in that pause, that 4-second pause while the therapist decided how to respond, Lily texted Grant's phone. He felt it vibrate in his pocket. He didn't look at it. He found out later what it said. Connor had called her, for the first time in months. He'd called her from his room while Serena thought he was asleep, and he'd said something that Lily wrote down verbatim because she knew, with the instincts of someone who had been watching this house carefully for years, that it mattered. He said, "I don't actually think he's the problem. I think I've been saying what she needed to hear." 16 years old, carrying that alone because he didn't yet know where else to put it. The therapist ended the session early, recommended they take a break and reconvene separately. There was no reconvening, but there was a conversation coming that none of them had scheduled, that couldn't be prepared for, that arrived the way the most important conversations always arrive, without warning, through the person you least expected to start it. Connor knocked on Grant's office door on a Tuesday evening in March. Not a school night knock, not the kind that comes with a question about homework or a request for something. Grant recognized the difference before Connor even said anything. The knock was slow, deliberate. The knock of someone who has been standing outside a door working up to it. Grant said, "Come in." Connor sat down in the chair across from the desk, the chair that had been there for years, the chair he'd sat in 100 times for 100 different conversations, most of them uncomfortable, all of them honest. He sat down and he didn't say anything for a moment, and Grant didn't fill the silence, because he'd learned a long time ago that some silences are doing necessary work. Connor said, "I think I've been unfair to you. Not, I'm sorry. Not, I was wrong. I think I've been unfair to you." Which was, Grant would think later, the most accurate possible sentence, because it didn't perform the feeling, it just named the thing. Grant said, "Okay, tell me what you mean." It took Connor 40 minutes to say what he'd been carrying. Some of it Grant already knew. The phone calls his mother didn't know he'd been making to Lily, the versions of Grant he'd performed for different audiences, the way he had learned to use his mother's narrative as a shield when accountability got close. He said it without excusing it. He said it like someone who had reached the limit of what he could hold privately and needed to put it somewhere that could actually receive it. He said that for a long time, he'd believed his mother's version. Not because he was naive, he was clear about that, almost fierce about it, but because it was easier. Because it meant the discomfort of living in Grant's house had a cause that wasn't him. And he was 14, 15, 16. He needed a cause that wasn't him. He said he'd started questioning it slowly, that there was no single moment, just the accumulation of noticing that the story didn't match his actual experience of Grant, That the man his mother described and the man who drove him to training on Saturday mornings and said nothing about the distance were not the same man. And at some point, you can't hold both versions. One has to give. He said, "The things she said you did, I know why she said them. I'm not saying she's lying, I just don't think she knows she's been doing it." Grant sat with that for a long time, because that sentence, "I don't think she knows she's been doing it," was the most generous possible read of what had happened in his house for the last 4 years. And it came from the kid who had the most reason to be less generous. He didn't tell Connor about the notebook. He didn't tell him about the therapy session, or Serena's 4-page document, or the way his own evidence had been reframed as pathology. He just said, "I know, and I'm glad you said something." Connor said, I didn't want you to think I believed it. The way she talks about you. I didn't want you to think that was me." It wasn't the apology Grant had rehearsed receiving in the quieter, more private moments of the last year. It was better than that. It was a 17-year-old choosing accuracy over comfort and delivering it to the person it was owed to. That's not nothing. That's actually everything. Grant and Serena didn't survive it, not as a couple. By summer, the house had been separated in the way that houses get separated. Quietly, practically, with a grief that neither of them had the language for, because it wasn't the clean grief of a dramatic ending. It was the grief of something that had been going wrong for a long time and had finally finished going wrong. Serena didn't see it that way. She had a version of the ending, the same way she'd had a version of everything else. And in her version, Grant had failed to do the work the relationship needed, and she had eventually had no choice. Grant didn't argue with her version. He had learned, somewhere in the last 4 years, that you cannot win an argument with a story that someone built to survive. You can only decide whether you're going to keep being a character in it. He decided he wasn't. Connor is 21 now. He calls Grant twice a month, sometimes more. He came to Lily's graduation last year and sat with Grant's side of the room. He is, by most visible measures, okay. The specific kind of okay that comes from having named the thing that was wrong and put it down. He asked Grant once if he regretted it. The whole 11 years. The consistency, the consequences, the standards that didn't move. Grant said no. He said, "You don't get to know in the middle whether what you're building is going to matter. You just have to build it like it will." Connor said he understood that now. And I believe him. Because understanding that, really understanding it, is what separates the people who show up from the people who wait to see if showing up is worth it first. The ones who wait are still waiting. If there's someone in your life who has been showing up consistently while a story gets written around them, send them this. Not as a message, just as a reminder that someone else saw it too. And if you've ever been the one that story was written about, you already know that the truth has a patience that outlasts almost anything. You just have to decide to keep being the version of yourself you can defend. The next story I want to tell you is about a woman who covered for her brother for 15 years, and the single voicemail that made her stop. That one is going to stay with you. I'll see you there. I'm Dee. I will see you by Firelight.